All right, let's dive in. This time, we're tackling the true cost of recent U.S. involvement in the Middle East, specifically the support for Israel. And honestly, going through this report has been pretty eye-opening. It's called United States Spending on Israel's Military Operations and Related U.S. Operations in the Region. Covers October 7th, 2023 to September 30th, 2024. Tries to, pull back the curtain on all this military spending and aid, which can be super murky. We've got a lot of big numbers to break down, but thankfully we've got our expert here to help make sense of the bigger picture, all these complex geopolitical situations.
Happy to lend my perspective.
So right off the bat, the report hits us with this. At least $17.9 billion, right, in security assistance to Israel in just 1 year. It's a lot of money, but it's more than just like the number itself, right?
You're absolutely right. What's really striking is that this $17.9 billion is the highest yearly amount since the U.S. started giving military aid to Israel. And that was way back in 1959. So, this could mean a pretty significant shift in U.S. foreign policy.
Okay, so to kind of grasp how much stuff we're talking about, it's mountains of equipment, like 57,000 artillery shells, 36,000 rounds of cannon ammunition, 20,000 M4A1 rifles, and on top of all that, thousands and thousands of missiles and bombs. It's kind of hard to wrap your head around that much military support.
And there's also this concern about transparency or a lack of it. The report points out over 100 arms deals that didn't even have to be reported to Congress, meaning, that $17.9 billion might just be like the tip of the iceberg. We might not even know the full story.
And then there's that other $20.3 billion, right, from those arms agreements announced in August that's still being debated in Congress.
Yeah.
So potentially like another huge EE amount on top of what's already been spent.
And it's important to remember that this aid, while massive, isn't coming out of nowhere. Israel has consistently been the biggest recipient of U.S. aid since World War II. I mean, think about this. From 1951 to 2022, the U.S. gave Israel an estimated, get this, $317 billion total. And $225 billion of that was specifically military aid. No other country gets this kind of special treatment, this unique financial arrangement.
So this current spending is part of a much larger, much longer commitment.
Exactly. It's been going on for decades, but now it's just, it's on a scale we haven't seen before.
Okay, but the report doesn't just focus on Israel. It also looks at the costs of another conflict, maybe not as widely discussed, but definitely connected, the U.S. military operations against those Houthi militants in Yemen.
Right. And, while they might seem separate at first glance, what's happening with the Houthis is actually linked to the situation with Israel. The Houthis claim those attacks they're making on shipping are like retaliation for Israel's actions in Gaza, a way to, disrupt trade and put pressure on them.
See, this is where it gets interesting for me. What exactly are these attacks, and how is the U.S. involved?
Basically, the Houthis are targeting shipping routes. The ones, that are crucial for international trade. And the U.S., obviously with their interest in global stability, they've responded by upping their military presence, like big time. They've doubled their fighter squadrons, brought in more air defense systems, and they've even deployed multiple aircraft carrier strike groups. Those are like massive and incredibly expensive to operate.
So the U.S. is shelling out billions to protect these shipping lanes from Houthi attacks.
Yeah. The report estimates those operations cost at least $4.86 billion. And that's probably on the low end. Remember, that's in addition to all the aid going to Israel.
Well, okay, so we're talking close to $23 billion already, and that's just the direct costs. Can you break down that $4.86 billion a bit? What does that look like on the ground?
Sure. So just to give you an idea, by June of 2024, the U.S. had already blown through $1 billion on munitions alone in this conflict. That's a lot of firepower. And it highlights a real issue. The U.S. is using super high-tech, expensive weaponry against these relatively cheap Houthi drones. It's almost like using a sledgehammer to crack a nut. Way too costly and not always effective.
So the U.S. is caught in this asymmetrical conflict, spending a fortune to fight a much less sophisticated enemy.
Exactly. And then there's the human cost, which we often forget about when we're talking about these big numbers. 2 U.S. service members were killed in January of this year, 2024. They were trying to seize Iranian-made missiles that were supposedly headed for Yemen.
Yeah, it's a stark reminder that these conflicts, they have very real consequences. It's not just about the money.
Yeah, it's easy to just focus on those direct military costs, but the impact of this conflict is, it goes way beyond that. It's kind of like throwing a stone in a pond. The splash is just the beginning. Right?
Yeah. Okay, so we've got the billions in spending. But what are these wider consequences you're talking about?
Well, one area that's feeling it is global shipping. All this conflict has made those key routes, like the Suez Canal and the Gulf of Aden, a lot riskier. And that really messes with how goods move around the world.
Right.
Yeah.
I remember reading about ships having to go way out of their way to avoid the conflict zone.
Exactly. It puts shipping companies in a tough spot. They can either go all the way around Africa, which adds like 10 days to the trip, and that's not even mentioning the extra fuel costs. We're talking an extra $300,000 per trip.
No.
Or they can risk going through the danger zone, but then their insurance premiums go through the roof. Either way, it hurts their bottom line.
So basically, no matter what they choose, it's going to cost them a fortune. And those costs, they don't just disappear, do they?
Nope, not at all. All those added expenses, they get passed down the line, eventually landing on us, the consumers. We end up paying more for all sorts of things because shipping costs have gone up. It's like, it's a hidden cost of conflict that we don't always think about.
It's crazy how something happening, halfway across the world can affect how much I pay for groceries here at home.
Absolutely. And those economic impacts, they go even further. Like, all this conflict has been a big factor in the global energy market turmoil, which means, those price hikes at the gas pump you've been seeing?
Oh, so that's part of the reason why filling up my tank has been so painful lately.
Big part of it. The Middle East is, a huge oil producer, so any instability there, it kind of sends shock waves through the entire global energy system. And those price swings, they don't just affect drivers, they hit businesses too, driving up transportation costs, squeezing their profits. It can even lead to job losses in some cases.
Wow, it's like this chain reaction, starting with the conflict and then ultimately impacting all of us in some way.
Exactly. And we can't forget about the human cost either, All this fighting, it's created a humanitarian crisis. Millions of people displaced, forced from their homes, desperate for help. The images coming out of Gaza are just, they're heartbreaking.
Yeah, it's easy to forget that those images, they're real people whose lives have been shattered by this.
Exactly right. The UN estimates that millions have been displaced, both within Gaza and also to neighboring countries. It puts immense pressure on resources, infrastructure, and, creates this breeding ground for even more instability and conflict.
It's a tragic situation, and it seems like the need for humanitarian aid is just going to keep growing.
Absolutely. And while the international community has pledged billions in aid, the needs are just, they're overwhelming. And it's not just about the basics, like food, water, shelter. It's about rebuilding entire lives, helping communities recover, dealing with the trauma that war leaves behind. It's a long, difficult process, and it needs a sustained commitment from the whole world.
So we've got these huge financial costs, the economic ripple effects that hit everyone, and then the just massive human suffering. It's a pretty bleak picture.
Yeah, it is. And on top of all that, there's another layer to all this that's maybe the most worrying part. The risk of this conflict escalating beyond just Israel and Gaza.
You mean like spreading and pulling in other countries in the region?
Exactly. The Middle East is, well, it's a powder keg. This conflict, it could easily set off a much bigger fire. We've already seen how those Houthi attacks are connected to the situation in Gaza. It's a reminder of how interconnected everything is.
And you always have to worry about like miscalculations, unintended consequences, things that could quickly spiral out of control.
Exactly. That's why it's so crucial for everyone involved to, show restraint, prioritize finding a diplomatic solution. The stakes are incredibly high, not just for the region, but for the entire world.
So you're saying this conflict could actually destabilize the entire Middle East, maybe even have global consequences?
It's a very real possibility. The Middle East is strategically vital, both for, energy resources and its geopolitical significance. Any major conflict there, it sends shockwaves everywhere.
It's a sobering thought. This conflict, it's already costing so much, and it could escalate even further.
It could. And we've already seen the impact on energy prices and global shipping, right?
Right.
If it were to escalate, those consequences would be even more intense, more far-reaching.
Yeah, it's a scenario that nobody wants to imagine, but it's a risk we can't ignore. Okay, so we spent this deep dive really getting into the real costs of this conflict, right? We've seen the billions, the economic fallout, and of course the human toll. But what now? I mean, can anything be done to fix this? Is there any hope for peace?
Well, it's important to, be realistic about this. There's no easy solution. No magic wand we can wave to make everything all right. This conflict, it goes deep. It's like layers upon layers of historical grievances, political disputes, a whole tangle of competing interests.
So you're saying there's no one thing that's going to just solve everything?
Right. It's going to take a lot of work, a long-term, multifaceted approach. And that means a lot of tough conversations, a lot of compromise from everyone involved.
That sounds pretty daunting. Where do you even start with something this complicated?
I think the first step is to really change how we think about the conflict. We need to get away from those polarized black and white narratives that we see everywhere. We got to acknowledge the nuances, the complexities.
I see what you mean. It's easy to fall into that us versus them mindset, but that just keeps the cycle of violence going.
Exactly. We need to step back and recognize that, there are legitimate concerns on all sides. People have real grievances. And that means, having more honest conversations that prioritize listening and understanding.
That sounds good in theory, but how do you actually do that? I mean, how do you create space for dialogue when there's so much anger, so much pain?
Oh, it's definitely a challenge, a huge one. But it's not impossible. It starts with, everyone involved making a commitment to really listen to each other, try to see the world from the other side's perspective, and be willing to give a little.
That's asking a lot, isn't it?
Mhm.
Especially in a region with, such a long and painful history.
It is. It is. But it's the only way to get to a real lasting peace. The alternative is just more violence, more instability, and that only leads to more suffering, makes those divisions even deeper. It's a bad outcome for everyone.
So what can be done? What are some, actual steps to get there, towards this dialogue, towards peace?
Well, an immediate ceasefire is crucial. That's the bare minimum. It lets humanitarian aid get through to the people who need it, and it gives everyone a chance to, breathe, take a step back, and start those difficult conversations.
But a ceasefire, that's just a pause, right? It doesn't address the reasons behind the conflict.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Lasting peace means dealing with those root causes. And like we've been talking about, those are, they're numerous and incredibly complex.
Can you give us some examples? What are some of the key things that need to be addressed?
Sure. So, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, that's at the heart of a lot of this instability. And solving that means tackling some really tough issues like land rights, security concerns, the status of Jerusalem. Those are issues with a lot of history, a lot of emotional weight for both sides.
Yeah, it sounds like finding common ground on those issues would be incredibly difficult.
It is. But until those issues are dealt with in a way that everyone sees as fair and just, the cycle of violence is probably going to keep going. And we can't forget about the outside influences either. Countries like the US and Iran, they have a lot of influence in the region. And that often makes things more complicated, makes it harder to find that common ground.
So you're saying any solution has to involve not just those directly involved, but also the broader regional community.
Yeah.
And even the international community.
Exactly. It has to be a team effort. Everyone working together to de-escalate the situation and promote dialogue. And a big part of that is moving away from this idea of a zero-sum game, where one side wins and the other side automatically loses. We need to start thinking about shared interests, things that benefit everyone.
That's a really powerful idea that, we're all connected and one side's success doesn't have to come at the expense of the other. Everyone can benefit from peace.
Exactly. It's about finding solutions that work for everyone, that address everyone's legitimate concerns, that create a more secure and prosperous future for all.
This deep dive has really been eye-opening. The costs of this conflict, it's clear they're just enormous. Lives lost, wasted resources, and, a future that's full of uncertainty. But I gotta say, hearing your perspective gives me some hope. It's a long road ahead, but it sounds like there is a path towards peace, even if it's hard and everyone has to commit to it.
I agree. It's a complex situation, but not hopeless. It requires open minds, courageous leadership, and a willingness to, roll up our sleeves and work together for a better future.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us. It's been an incredibly insightful conversation, and I hope it encourages our listeners to really think about this conflict, about how complex it is and how much we need a peaceful resolution.
My pleasure. It's been a great conversation.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you found it informative, maybe even got you thinking a little differently about things. Keep learning, stay curious, and let's all work towards a world that's a little bit more just, a little bit more peaceful.